I always wondered what it felt like to be the golden child in a family, to be admired by your parents, surrounded by relatives without having to try too hard. But I never had the chance to experience that. In their eyes, I was nothing more than a shadow, a failure not good enough to be acknowledged. Meanwhile, my brother Henry was the shining star, the pride of the family, even though, in reality, he was just a braggart thriving on empty praise. We grew up in a small town in Ohio where everyone knew each other's business. My reputation as the kid with no future stuck with me from an early age, while Henry was cherished like an invincible warrior. From the start, my parents placed Henry on a pedestal. He played football in high school, scored a few touchdowns, and suddenly became the pride of the entire family. And me? I was the dreamy-eyed kid who preferred books over sports competitions. My father, Richard, was the kind of man who spent his life working tirelessly but never expressed his true feelings. He woke up at 5 a.m., drove to the construction site and returned home in silence, only muttering a few grumbles if dinner wasn't ready. He never hit me, but his silence was sometimes more terrifying than words. My mother, Eleanor, was a different story. She lived by traditional values. A model mother molded by the expectations she had been taught since childhood. To her, a real son had to be strong, have a family, and succeed in the way she deemed right. And Henry was the perfect embodiment of all those standards. Henry is now in his 30s, working a steady job at a local car dealership. People still call him a successful man, an ideal role model to compare me to. He has a big house with a neatly trimmed lawn, a quiet wife named Rachel, and 2 boys who constantly run around with footballs in their hands. My family worships Henry's image, endlessly talking about his achievements as if he were some renowned politician. And me? In their eyes, I am nothing. They think I can't stand on my own, can't succeed without help. They tell me I need to try harder, to learn from my brother. But the truth is, no matter what I do, they will never acknowledge me. Even when I worked hard, saved every penny to get into college, my decision to drop out in my second year was seen as proof of my failure. I also have a younger sister, Olivia, the little princess of the family. She got married at 20 and now has 3 kids. I don't remember much about Olivia when we were younger, but when we reconnected later, I realized she was just like our parents and Henry. Olivia wasn't cruel, but perhaps to secure her place in the family, she followed their lead, treating me as a pitiful failure. Sunday dinners were the worst part of the week. I'd drive nearly 2 hours just to hear them talk about Henry, Olivia's new house, who just bought a new car or who got promoted. If I mentioned my job, they'd ignore it or change the subject. They still thought I worked at the old comic book store from years ago, even though it had closed down a decade ago. And Henry, as always, would pat me on the shoulder and say in that grating voice, "Mela, you need to have a plan for the future. You can't keep drifting through life like this." I'd smirk. If they knew the truth about me, maybe things would be different. But I never said anything. Because even if I did, they wouldn't believe me. I was used to being overlooked, used to being seen as a failure. But what they didn't know was that I was no longer the weak child they once dismissed. I had my own life, my own career, and my own success. They just hadn't realized it yet. My childhood wasn't filled with warm family memories or cozy gatherings around the dinner table. It was a series of endless comparisons, belittlement, and being made to feel less than. When you grow up in a family where your worth is measured against someone else's achievements, you learn one thing. No matter how hard you try, you will never be good enough. From an early age, I was different from Henry. He was strong, athletic, winning medals in school tournaments. Every time he scored in a game, my family would cheer. My father would clap him on the back with a proud smile. And me? I never got a chance to make my parents proud in that way. I had asthma, which meant I couldn't participate in sports like Henry. I hated gym class, hated the long runs outside, hated the laughter of the boys when they saw me gasping for air, my face pale as if I were about to pass out. Every time I struggled to breathe, my mother would sigh and say, Amelia, you need to be stronger, stop making things so complicated. Stronger? No matter how much I tried to push through, in her eyes I would always be a disappointment. But perhaps the worst part wasn't the illness, it was the constant comparisons to Henry. If he was the pride, then what was I? Nothing. I wasn't great in school, not terrible, but my GPA hovered around 2.5. Not enough to impress anyone. Henry, on the other hand, wasn't a stellar student either, but he always knew how to make things seem bigger than they were. Henry isn't just talented, he has leadership qualities, my father once said when Henry was made team captain. And me? I was just the girl sitting in the library reading comic books, dismissed as someone lost in a useless fantasy world. After high school, I tried to do what was expected of me, go to college. I paid for tuition by working part-time at a small comic book and gaming store in town. To me, it was a dream job, surrounded by things I loved, meeting people who shared my interests. But to my family, it was the perfect symbol of my failure. Do you really want to spend your whole life working in a store that sells kids' stuff? My mother asked as she watched me put on my uniform one evening. I didn't respond. I knew that no matter what I said, she wouldn't understand. After 2 years in college, I dropped out. I couldn't stand the uninspiring classes, the constant criticism from my family, and the feeling that I was wasting my time on something that wasn't meant for me. To my family, that was the end of the road. They never said it outright, but I saw it in their eyes. You think dropping out was a smart decision? My father asked coldly. Henry has had a stable job for years, why can't you learn from him? For the first time in my life, I felt like I had truly disappeared from the family picture. They didn't care how I felt, didn't bother to ask why I left college. All they saw was a failure. A faint shadow, not worth expecting anything from. What they didn't know was that this decision was where my life truly began. After leaving college, I continued working at the comic book store, but not just to get by. I met a friend who shared my passion for technology, and together we started a small IT company. The early days were brutal. We worked tirelessly, and there were months when we barely made any money. But we kept going. And then, everything changed. Our company grew faster than we ever expected. We landed major contracts, expanded, and within just a few years, it became a valuable business. When we sold the company to a large corporation, I walked away from the deal with a sizable sum, an amount my family could never have imagined. I could live lavishly if I wanted to, but I didn't. I didn't need a mansion, didn't need a sports car to prove anything to anyone. I bought a modest 2-bedroom home, comfortable but not flashy. I drove an old car I loved, even if others saw it as a sign of failure. They had no idea what I had accomplished. They didn't know how much money was in my bank account. Because in their eyes, I was still the useless little sister. But one day the truth would come out, and I was very curious to see how they would react when they realized that the failure they had always looked down on was actually the most successful person in the family. I had no idea how Henry managed to live with such an inflated ego without being crushed under its weight. His whole life he wore the perfect mask, the model man, the golden child, the successful older brother. But I knew the truth. Henry had never truly succeeded in the way he bragged about. He might have fooled our parents, might have convinced the whole town that he was some role model, but I had always seen the cracks in the facade he built. And then, one day, that facade crumbled. I had no idea Henry had hired a private investigator to track me. He had never hidden his contempt for me. But paying someone just to prove I was a failure? That was new. I found out by accident. One day I received an alert about unauthorized access to my credit reports. I worked in cybersecurity. I wasn't unfamiliar with the signs of a personal investigation. Someone had been digging too deep into my financial records, and I knew this wasn't a coincidence. It didn't take long to trace it back. The detective agency Henry hired wasn't careful enough to cover their tracks completely. With just a little effort, I found out who had commissioned the investigation. And when I saw Henry's name, I wasn't even surprised. He had always been searching for proof that I was a failure, but this time, he had only hurt himself. I wasn't sure how prepared Henry was to face the truth, but I was certain he didn't expect the outcome he got. Instead of uncovering that I was still the useless little sister working at some comic book shop, the investigator he hired unearthed the entire truth. I wasn't a failure. I wasn't struggling. I wasn't some loser clinging to the past. I was the co-founder of a successful tech company. I had over $1 million in assets. I owned a beautiful home in a desirable neighborhood, and most importantly, I didn't need my family's approval. Whether Henry liked it or not, the information made its way to my parents. For the first time in my life, I saw them look at me differently. Not with disappointment. Not with the constant frustration they always seemed to have whenever I showed up at family dinners. But with shock. They no longer looked at me like a daughter who needed help. They no longer saw me as an embarrassment. Suddenly, I had become someone worth noticing. "Amelia, why didn't you ever tell me about your success?" my mother asked with an awkward smile, as if she was trying to act happy for me. I shrugged. "Did you ever care?" My father, the man who had never shown much emotion, looked unsettled. He cleared his throat and nodded slowly. "You've done very well." That was probably the first compliment I had ever received from him in nearly 30 years of existence. But the most interesting reaction didn't come from my parents. It came from Henry. Henry couldn't accept the fact that I, the little sister he had always looked down on, had become more successful than him. At the next family dinner, he tried to reclaim his dignity. "My sister is very talented, but selling cars is a great career too." He folded his arms, trying to sound confident. "In fact, just last month, I sold the most expensive car at the dealership." No one reacted. My mother was still busy processing the numbers she had learned about my assets. My father remained silent as usual, and Olivia, my younger sister, simply stared at Henry without saying a word. But Henry didn't stop there. "My house was recently appraised higher than expected, and I have a solid financial plan. I might even invest in real estate." I couldn't help but laugh. He was scrambling, desperately clinging to anything that could maintain his status. I met his eyes, steady and unprovoked. "Are you sure about that, Henry?" He froze. I tilted my head. "Because from what I know, you have 3 unpaid mortgages, outstanding tax debt with the IRS, and your credit score is plummeting." The silence in the room became suffocating. Henry's fists clenched, his jaw tightened. I could see the flicker of rage in his eyes, but he couldn't do anything about it. For the first time in my life, I had a voice. And Henry knew it. No one in my family truly understood what it felt like to have your privacy violated, but I did. Henry hiring a private investigator to dig into my life wasn't just an insult. It was a clear declaration that he had never seen me as a person with real worth. To him, I was still the failure he needed to expose, so everyone would see that I wasn't worth admiring. He was wrong. And I was going to show him. I hired the same detective agency he had used to turn the tables on him. I wanted to know if Henry was as perfect as he always claimed to be. The results exceeded my expectations. When I walked into my parents' house that Sunday evening, the atmosphere in the dining room was different. My mother busied herself with the casserole, my father silently read his newspaper as usual, and Henry sat with his arms crossed, wearing a smug expression like he had just won an important game. I knew why. He thought he had won, that now that my parents knew I was wealthy, I would be pulled back into the family circle, expected to share what I had. I pulled out my chair and sat down, keeping my face neutral, but inside I was fully prepared for the storm ahead. Dinner began the same way it always did, with stories about Henry. "Your brother just hit his highest sales target this month," my mother announced proudly. "Really?" I replied with a small smile, casually placing a piece of meat on my plate. "That's impressive, Henry. Quite the achievement." Henry shot me a wary glance. I had never shown interest in his bragging before, and I was sure he sensed something different tonight. Everything went exactly as I expected. After a while, Henry couldn't hold back anymore. You know, Amelia? He leaned forward, smirking. Money isn't everything. What matters is reputation, the respect a man earns in society. I set my fork down and looked up at him. Oh? And how's your reputation doing? Henry frowned. What do you mean? I slowly pulled a thick envelope from my bag and placed it in front of him. You're not the only one who knows how to hire a private investigator, Henry. The room tensed immediately. Henry stiffened, but he tried to maintain his composure. What nonsense are you talking about? I tilted my head, calmly opening the envelope and pulling out each document. 3 unpaid mortgages, tax debt with the IRS, a credit score barely hanging on. I read off each item one by one. Oh, and this one. A file from Child Protective Services. Would you like to explain why your name is on it? Henry slammed his hand on the table. Shut up, Amelia. My parents were stunned. My mother clutched her chest, staring at my brother in horror, as if she had never truly known who he was. Henry, what is this about? She asked, her voice trembling. He didn't answer right away. I could see the panic in his eyes, the frantic search for an escape from the trap he had set for himself. I met his gaze, my voice calm but sharp. You invaded my privacy just to prove that I was a failure. But it turns out, you're the one with the real problems. Henry suddenly shot up from his chair, jabbing a finger at me in rage. You're just trying to bring me down, you've always been jealous of me. I let out a cold, short laugh. Jealous? Henry, there is nothing about you that I would ever envy. He slammed his fist on the table again. You shouldn't have been born. I've carried this family on my back my whole life, while you've been nothing but useless. My mother gasped and grabbed his arm. Henry! Don't say that. For the first time that evening my father spoke. Both of you, calm down. But it was too late. Henry's fury had completely erupted. He turned to my parents, his voice shaking with anger. You've never been fair. Never, he shouted. Why is it that the moment Amelia shows up with some money, you suddenly change your attitude? What about me? I did everything right. I got married, had kids, built a career. And now you're all worshipping her? A heavy silence filled the room. For the first time, I saw my parents truly at a loss for words. And I knew then that things would never go back to the way they were. I drove away from my parents' house that night, my mind spinning with too many thoughts. There was no music playing from the radio like usual, no street noises distracting me. Just a suffocating silence, wrapped around me along with a truth that had always been there. One I had never dared to fully face. My parents had never truly loved me. They loved the idea of a child who could bring them pride, wealth, and admiration from society. They loved the image of a perfect family more than they loved the people within it. And now, when they realized I had money, their attitude shifted instantly. Not because they suddenly saw my worth, but because I had something they could use. Since childhood, I had always been the target of favoritism. Henry could do anything and still be forgiven, while, no matter how hard I tried, I was always pushed to the sidelines. I remembered the times he shoved me to the ground when we were kids, the punches thrown when no adults were watching, the times I was humiliated in front of his friends. And my parents? They never protected me. They told me it was just kids playing around, that I should toughen up, that Henry was only trying to make me stronger. But that wasn't guidance. That was abuse, disguised with weak excuses. And now, as Henry stood on the edge of his own downfall, they were terrified. Not because of what he had done, but because, for the first time, the truth about him could no longer be hidden. I had spent my entire life trying to make them see me, but tonight, I realized I had never truly existed in their eyes. And it was time for me to stop trying. I woke up the next morning feeling a strange sense of relief. It wasn't joy, nor satisfaction. Just the simple, undeniable feeling of having set down a burden I had carried for 30 years. I no longer blamed them. I no longer sought their approval. And more importantly, I no longer let them have control over my life. I picked up my phone and sent a message to my mother. "Mom, I won't be coming to Sunday dinners anymore. I need space to process everything. When I'm ready, I'll reach out." I didn't expect an apology from her. And as expected, her reply was short and dismissive. "You're overreacting, Amelia. Family should come first." I didn't respond. I simply set my phone down and went on with my day, letting her words roll off me. But I knew this wasn't over. I knew my parents wouldn't let this go. And I needed to prepare myself for what was coming next. 3 days later, I sat across from my therapist, Dr. Bennett. I had been seeing her for years, but for the first time, I felt the need to lay everything out. "They only want me now because I have money," I sighed, crossing my arms as I sank into the familiar chair. Dr. Bennett nodded slowly. "And how does that make you feel?" I was silent for a moment. Then, I let out a small, bitter laugh. "Honestly, relieved. I don't have to prove myself to them anymore." She tilted her head, observing me. "Then what's still making you tense?" I took a deep breath. "I know they won't leave me alone. They'll keep trying to pull me back in, keep manipulating me with that fake sense of family love. So what do you want to do?" I looked her in the eye, and for the first time in my life, I knew the answer. "I'm going to set boundaries. I won't let them use me anymore." I started changing the way I interacted with my family. I no longer responded immediately to my mother's guilt-tripping messages. I didn't engage in the long, drawn-out phone calls where my parents tried to convince me to reconsider. And most importantly, I didn't let them manipulate me with talk about how family is everything. I also started focusing on myself more. I spent time enjoying the life I had built for myself. I surrounded myself with people who truly respected me. People who didn't need me to prove my worth through money or success. And for the first time in my life, I felt free. I knew there would be hard days ahead. I knew Henry wouldn't accept defeat easily. That my parents would keep trying to pull me back into their orbit. But this time, I was ready. I had spent my whole life trying to earn their approval. But now, I didn't need it anymore. I didn't need them to define my worth. And that was what truly mattered. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt truly free. Maybe it was when I was very young, before I realized my family's favoritism, before I understood that no matter how hard I tried, I would never be valued like Henry. But now, I was taking back control of my life. One step at a time. A life no longer suffocated by unrealistic expectations or judgmental stares from people who were supposed to love me. And then, just as I was starting to reshape myself, Luca appeared. The cybersecurity conference in San Francisco was an event I had almost skipped. If it weren't for a colleague convincing me that it was a great opportunity for networking, I probably would have stayed home, curled up on my couch with a book. But I went. And it turned out to be one of the best decisions I ever made. Luca was the keynote speaker at a seminar on personal cybersecurity. He wasn't just knowledgeable, he had a rare confidence that commanded the room. His deep, steady voice, his sharp eyes, he captivated everyone with every word. But what struck me the most wasn't his expertise. It was the way he talked about personal boundaries. We protect our data, but we allow people to invade our personal space so easily. Boundaries aren't about distance. They're about protection. That sentence hit me like a wake-up call, shaking me out of my hesitation. After the seminar, I gathered the courage to approach Luca. I wasn't the type to start conversations with strangers, but something about him made me feel safe. We talked about work, about the flaws in the cybersecurity industry, about how people often protected their information better than they protected themselves. And before I knew it, we were sitting across from each other in a quiet corner of a coffee shop outside the conference center, drinking coffee together. "You seem like someone who keeps their distance from everything," Luca observed, taking a sip of his espresso. I laughed. "Not exactly. I've just spent my whole life being forced into someone else's mold. Now I'm just trying to take back control, so I'm not constantly being managed." Luca nodded, his eyes full of understanding. "I get that. Sometimes the most important thing isn't cutting people off, It's learning how to manage relationships on your own terms. He didn't know it, but with just one sentence, he had given me the answer I had been searching for all along. My relationship with Luca developed naturally. We spent time together without pressure, without expectations. He wasn't just someone who listened. He helped me see things from a new perspective. You don't have to disappear from your family's life, Luca said one evening as we sat on his balcony, looking out at the city below. You just need to set boundaries. They may not like it, but they'll have to accept it. So I tried. I didn't cut ties with my parents like I once thought I would, but I also didn't let them manipulate me anymore. Instead of long, exhausting dinners where I was put on the defensive, I suggested short coffee meetups in places where I could control the situation. At first, my mother resisted. Families don't meet in coffee shops, Amelia. That's not how we do things. I simply replied, then you have a choice. You can meet me this way, or not see me at all. For the first time in my life, she seemed to understand that I was no longer the Amelia they could bend to their will. At first, the short meetings were tense. My mother kept trying to lure me back into Sunday dinners, my father remained quietly observant, and Henry refused to show up at all. But over time, they began to accept reality. The conversations became shorter, with fewer criticisms, no more forced questions about marriage, no more meaningless comparisons to Henry. And the most important part? I no longer felt suffocated. I no longer needed to prove anything to them. I no longer felt the need to fight for their recognition. I simply existed, as myself, on my own terms. Luca was right. I didn't need to cut my family off. I just needed to control the relationship on my own terms. One evening, as I sat on the balcony with Luca, he turned to me, his eyes reflecting the city lights. Do you feel better? I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in years. Yes. For the first time in my life, I feel truly free, in a way that I choose. I didn't know when distancing myself from my family had started bringing me so much peace. The short coffee meetings, the fewer phone calls, the messages I no longer felt pressured to reply to immediately, all were signs of a change. A change I knew was necessary. My mother still tried to pull me back into the old dynamic. She sent subtle messages, reminders about family responsibilities, and how family bonds are irreplaceable. But the difference was, I no longer felt guilty for refusing. I understood now that family should not be a chain that binds. If I had to sacrifice my mental well-being just to maintain a relationship, then that wasn't real family. Henry, as I had predicted, still couldn't accept the truth. He never showed up for any meetings, never responded to my messages, and even went out of his way to avoid me when possible. It didn't bother me. I knew his pride was too big to face me after the truth about his life had been exposed. Maybe one day, he would find a way to regain balance. But that was no longer my concern. I no longer let my family define my worth. My life moved forward, but this time, I wasn't walking alone. Luca and I spent more time together, and with each passing day, I realized he understood me better than anyone ever had. Not because he tried to change me, but because he accepted me exactly as I was. One crisp autumn evening, we sat on the balcony of his apartment, sipping red wine as we looked out over the city. Have you ever thought about starting a family? Luca asked, his deep voice steady. I smiled softly, swirling the wine in my glass. I think about it more than you'd expect. He tilted his head slightly, waiting for me to continue. I took a deep breath. For most of my life, I thought family was a burden. Something that trapped you, controlled you, made you lose yourself. But now, I understand that family doesn't have to be that way. Family can be something we build, not something we are forced to accept. Luca smiled, gently taking my hand. Exactly. I met his eyes, and for the first time, I truly felt ready for a new future. A future not overshadowed by the past, but one where I could freely choose my own path. I used to think success meant making my parents proud. I used to chase that idea, only to realize they would never see me the way I had hoped. Now, I understood that success wasn't about earning their approval. Success was waking up each morning without the weight of expectations crushing my chest. It was choosing relationships that brought me peace instead of ones that dragged me down. I didn't need my parents' validation to feel worthy. I didn't need to prove myself to Henry. I didn't need to be some perfect version of myself just to be accepted. I just needed to be me. And that was enough. I continued seeing my therapist regularly, not because I was weak, but because I understood that mental health was just as important as physical health. Dr. Bennett helped me realize that setting boundaries wasn't selfish, it was necessary. I learned to say no without feeling guilty. I learned to put myself first without fearing judgment. I learned to love without letting others take advantage of my kindness. And most importantly, I learned to keep moving forward without looking back. I still kept a certain distance from my family. I was no longer the daughter who showed up every Sunday, sitting through empty lectures or being compared to Henry. But I didn't disappear entirely either. The coffee meetings continued, but I no longer let them affect me. I expected nothing from them, and because of that, I no longer felt disappointed. I wasn't sure what the future would hold. I didn't know if Henry would ever change. I couldn't say for certain that one day my mother would truly accept me for who I was. But I knew one thing. I was living the life I chose. I had a career I loved. I had an incredible partner. And for the first time in my life, I felt free. As I sat next to Luca in a small cafe on a late afternoon, my hand wrapped around his, I knew I was no longer the Amelia of the past. I was no longer the child seeking approval from people who never truly cared. I was myself. And that was more than enough. Amelia's story is not just about breaking free from family control, it's a lesson in self-worth. In reality, many people find themselves trapped by family expectations and manipulation, forgetting that true happiness doesn't come from external validation, but from inner peace. Amelia teaches us that sometimes, walking away from toxic relationships and setting boundaries is the best way to reclaim ourselves. Success isn't about pleasing everyone. It's about living in alignment with our own values. What do you think about Amelia's story? If you've ever experienced something similar, how would you handle it? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to follow the channel for more stories about life, family, and the journey to self-discovery.
My name is Riley.